Welcome back to Homelands, and we're listening to Jessica Iron, and Jess is sharing. She's a yogi, she's a PhD dissertation in education, she's a principal, she's a mother, she's done conflict resolution. She's got a fabulous podcast called Philosophy, which we will be philanthropy, sorry, which we will be philanthropy philosophy, the philosophy of philanthropy. I'm renaming her podcast, which we will be sharing on our YouTube channel so that you can access it, but you can find it on Apple Music, Spotify, and YouTube. So look for that. And so we've just been talking about BIPOC Mental Health Month and healing and kind of what that looks like a little bit, some of the collective trauma that everybody has to heal from. And I think settlers as well have to heal. A lot of people that came over here came from, dysfunctional situations too, and
Yeah.
enacted that trauma in different ways too. Like we all, as a country, as a nation, as a world, have healing to do. So yeah, I
Mhm.
don't know where you want to kind of dive in with that, but um, and then kind of ties in with conflict resolution too. And I mean, you can pull from your podcasts as well if you want to. So I'll let you kind of go where you want to go there.
All right, thank you. I'm grateful to be back and I'm happy to continue on this series talking about healing as a result of BIPOC Mental Health Month. And I just kind of wanted to comment a little bit on something that you just said, and you said it a little bit on the last episode about Canada Day and how for some people, it's a time of celebration. And for a lot of Indigenous people right now, there's a lot of anger. And so when we look at Canada Day, there's, a lot of people are wearing orange shirts because, they're not proud of the history of Canada and they don't want to celebrate or condone a lot of those things. And so it can leave a lot of Indigenous people and maybe other people in the BIPOC community, as I always say, I can't speak for anybody else but myself. But there are a lot of mixed feelings about Canada Day. And I never want anybody to feel that I judge them if they celebrate Canada Day, because exactly what you said, there are a lot of people who came to this country because of, atrocious things that had happened in their own country, and they needed somewhere to go. And they came to Canada, and you know what, Indigenous people, they were okay with that. If you look at the history, for the most part, a lot of times, during the fur trade, people really embraced these new nations with curiosity and brotherhood, and were welcome and willing to share this land, which led to the treaties. It could have been war, but for Indigenous nations, colonization was a foreign concept because it was never, ever in any Indigenous culture that I know of. Something that we thought of, you should think like me, you should be like me, you should do like me. Nobody ever did that. In fact, when we look at the history of our nation across Turtle Island, people were very respectful of boundaries. And so we had natural boundaries in on the land where people understood that, this is Dene territory, this is Blackfoot country, this is Cree country. And if you're to cross, then you needed to have permission. And so, people would, talk with these nations if they weren't fighting. But people were mostly respectful, and they were never like, oh, I'm going to try and turn all of these Blackfoot people into Cree people. I'm going to take all these Dene people and make them Cree. That was never the idea. So this concept of colonization was very unusual to Indigenous people because there was very much that respectful understanding that you are who you are and I am who I am, and we can coexist peacefully on this land, but with some parameters. And sometimes people cross those parameters, and then, battles happened and wives were kidnapped, definitely. And sometimes, and people understood that, people um, got wives from different nations to change the bloodlines because, maybe there was too much closeness in that, biological history, genetics, and so they needed to widen that gene pool a bit. So people knew that. But for the most part, people were very respectful. And so when these new nations came in, um, there was none of that, you need to do it as I'm doing it. It was like very much, you can do it how you like, but this is how we do things. And so that's what the treaties were about. They were about respecting nation to nation. And it was never about, coercion or dominance or anything like that. And so when I think of even now, we fast forward to Canada Day. I think that's where a lot of people feel that there was a lot of unjustness, that the government came in with a different agenda, the churches came in with a different agenda, and so there was deception at the time of treaties that they were not understood completely, and so that's where we look at the 150 years of Canada that people are celebrating, and Indigenous people are saying, "What the heck?" And so a lot of people are saying, no, 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 you need to stop and we need to take a look at what the original agreement was in this land. And we need to work on those relationships. And so that's what I wanted to focus on for this episode was healing those relationships. The last episode we talked about healing ourselves, our individual self, and how, the different ways we can go about doing that. But also understanding that we're a part of a community, and if you're an Indigenous person and you're disconnected from your Indigenous community, that's where we see a lot of the, unhealthy behaviors because, where I said in the last episode, we see a lot of confusion and we see a lot of lateral violence and toxicity because people don't know who they are. And so you're operating from a disoriented sense of self. Now, when you start to connect to yourself, and as I said in the last episode, to Creator, in whatever way you pray, I definitely don't want anyone to think that you have to convert to being an Indigenous, spirituality, ceremonial person, because I'm very fine and respectful of people praying however they pray, because I do think that we all pray to the same place. But ultimately, when you have a sense of connection to Creator, that it's naturally empowering. And, and also by extension, when we relate to our community and we connect to our community, then we also find that sense of identity and we see more repair to our culture, to our history, and we see more people returning to their language and their ceremonies. And as humans, I always say we can be fine by ourselves. There's a lot of people who say, "Oh, I could just go off into the bush and never talk to another soul, and I'd be happy." And I think that's true to an extent for anybody, even for myself, because I know I'm an introvert by nature. And so for myself, I love to get back to that sense of self. And when I think of that sense of self, for me, it's always that connection to Creator. Because Creator guides everything in my life, and that's the most important relationship in my world. But I also understand that I come from a community, I come from a family, and so I have a responsibility. We are social creatures by nature. And so it is our duty to try and have peaceful relationships within our family, within our community, and then the greater community. And so even if we think of, the rest of Canada, we're honoring our ancestors' legacies when we try to make a better Canada. And that's true for all of us, not just the Indigenous people, but even the settlers who came here. You know, when you think of those treaties, you think of, what was intended at that time of treaty signing. And maybe there was some deception at that time of treaty signing. But I do genuinely think that there were a lot of people who came to Canada and were grateful for a new opportunity and some change, something different from what had been going on in their own lands. And if you think of a lot of the, cultures that came over here, like Hutterites and Mennonites, they were naturally peaceful people, and they weren't, they didn't condone war. They didn't condone these sorts of acts. And so, to come to this new land and have this opportunity to live peacefully was a blessing. And so I think, when we think of that, moving forward, how do we uphold that legacy and continue it, as it was intended at the time? And unfortunately, I think it's mostly the Indigenous people who say, hey, wait a minute, that wasn't what was intended at the time of treaty signing. And so there's a lot of that, a lot of Indigenous people saying, hey, let's go back to what was the intention. And that's okay. Maybe that's where we need to renegotiate that relationship. But that doesn't mean it's an easy process. It can be a messy process trying to develop those relationships with other people and with other nations inside of Canada. I'm going to pause here so that you can share your thoughts, Andrea. I know you have probably a lot of thoughts about some of the things I said.
Oh, so good. Yeah, it's interesting. So I don't know if I've ever talked about this, but and I don't think I've ever talked about it on the show, but my great uncle Emmett Hall was a Supreme Court Chief Justice, but he started out as a Treaty 6 lawyer. He came up fresh out of university and he said, "Hey, boys, I'm Irish. I know how it works. It's illegal for you to have a lawyer, but you need one to negotiate. You can't hire one. I'll work for you for free, And he just kind of he went and worked with the Treaty 6. And that is where, when he wrote Medicare, as a Supreme Court Chief Justice, he wrote the whole Medicare Act and created it. It came from the Treaty 6 promise, a medicine chest for all people in times of need. So all the chiefs know that. They kind of know um, they know who I am. No, but they kind of know I'm a bit of a legacy project in terms of I'm trying to make the treaties walk in a way and make people aware of that legacy that that hey, anything that does work in Medicare, free Medicare for all people comes from the Treaty 6 promise. And things like it was to a plow's depth, and so all this kind of mining that they're doing, and different things, oil and uranium, which was never meant to come out of the ground, and kind of all that kind of thing that ups the cancer rates, right? Like all these things. And yeah, it's such a it's such a huge issue, right? But it's all of ours. Like when you see the Treaty 6 medal, it's two people shaking hands, two equals, two nations shaking hands. And I don't know if you can see it. I'm trying to lift my so you can see it. But it's the Two Row Wampum Belt by Christy Belcourt in my
Mhm.
background. Yeah,
Mhm.
and it's like two nations side by side. They're identical, right? Like they're both equal. And so that's how it's meant to be. We're both meant to flow up that river together. As long as the tree, as long as the rivers flow and the grasses grow and the sun shines, and we're supposed to be sharing the land and living as equals. And it's not like that. Like another part that I didn't talk about on Canada Day, but it happened when I came out of the hospital. And it was really funny because I'm dressed like I've got this tattoo, and I've got like a headband with maple leaves, and I've got these crazy sunglasses with maple leaves, and red, white shirt that says Canada since 1867. I thought, well, at least that's on brand. You know, I'm
Yeah,
admitting that, there
it's
was a
true.
pretty yeah, she picked the black one, so I went, good, at least I have some truth on my shirt. And what else did I have? Anyways, I mean, I might as well have had a flag as a cape, you know. This one guy was just looking at me in the hospital, and I said, "Are you a hugger?" And he said, "No." And he was indigenous, visibly indigenous. And I said, "Canada owes you a hug. $5 a year is not enough." And he started laughing. He goes, "Well, at least you know your history." And I said, "Believe me, I'm not dressed like this voluntarily." I said, so then we kind of had a conversation at the end. He was kind of okay with things, but it was kind of funny. Like I could see people looking at me like either they were laughing and they were like, "Yay, happy Canada Day," or they were kind of like,
Yeah.
uh-huh. Here goes a Freedom Convoy person. And I'm like, no. So it was a very funny experience, but I got to my car and there was a person kind of weaving around and I said, "Are you okay?" She said, "I'm trying to help my friend." And there was, someone in a high vis outfit and they were both really um you know under the influence and the construction workers were right there, like it was, University Bridge and everything is all under construction, and they said, "We're scared they're going to call the police. Are you going to call the police?" I said, "No, I don't, I'm not going to call the police, not me." And then the construction workers were kind of like, "You okay over there, Miss Canada?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm fine, I'm fine." And they're like, "Are they going to call the police?" And I said, "You know what? Get in my car. Let's go get you guys something to eat." And so that was part of my Canada Day adventure as well. Driving them around and getting some food in them and just kind of hearing their story. And yeah, it was it was very interesting. Like, they got in the car, not too sure if they were safe, and immediately my car starts blasting A Tribe Called Red. And they're like, "Oh, you're okay." It was funny. It was funny. They're like, "Who is this white lady playing A Tribe Called Red?" On Canada Dre, dressed in all this, red and white with a face tattoo that says "I love Canada." But it was very funny. And, I asked them where they were from, and I knew the one guy's his grandfather, and she ended up she was all bruised, and it ended up being him that had, beat her up when they were drinking too much. And so I just kind of spent time with them separately. And for me as a DV survivor, that was very healing to do on Canada Day, was just kind of talk about, I talked to both of them about it, and I talked to him especially, and just really encouraged him to get help. I said, "There's help for that, and you don't have to go through this cycle anymore. I know you don't feel good about it." And, he was crying, and yeah, I gave him like lots of hugs and just kind of talked to him about it. And um he said, "Nobody's ever talked to me like this, and thank you." And they were both calling me an angel. That happens a lot. It's my street name. um but
Aw.
uh but yeah, it was an interesting aspect. Like I don't know if I ever talked about my play Dominion, but that is the premise behind it, is that there's an abusive marriage with Jacques, Jack and Marie Philippe. Then they're, French and British, and they're in a house where they have the original occupants locked in the bathroom, right? And that's Tatawa and Nimita, who are, Cree speaking, and they're locked in the bathroom and they're trying to get out. And the rules are written on the toilet paper, but they can change them at any time. And, it's kind of like a metaphor for Canada as an abusive relationship within an abusive relationship.
Mm.
Yeah, so it was kind of interesting. That's what that's part of what my Canada Day was, kind of dealing with that kind of thing and that trauma and all of that kind of thing. So it's kind of a side side kind of story, but yeah, I was thinking about, that's what I was thinking about when you were talking about, kind of that collective trauma and the healing, and
Yeah.
just like where we are as a nation, and the fact that the construction workers, they were scared of them, right? Like a bunch of
Mm.
a bunch of very well paid guys who were going to call on the Indigenous drunks on Canada Day. Um and I was like, "You know what, I understand. I would be drinking on Canada Day too, probably, if I wasn't, lucky enough to be, in first of all, in a privileged body, but second of all, the fact that I'm living a sober lifestyle by choice, and
Mm.
have been through my own my own journey as well. So I mean, it's a journey. It's like you say, right? Like we're going through it all the way. We're all walking one another home. I love is that
Mm,
Ram Dass kind of saying that we're all walking one another home. So yeah,
mm.
I don't know where else we have about maybe see about it's about we're about at 20 minutes. We have about like 7.5 minutes, 8 minutes left.
Yeah.
So if you want
Well,
to kind of talk about things, wrap things up in terms of
sure.
yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing, that story, not only of, the couple that you met on Canada Day, but even some of your own background. It's not easy to share some really intimate parts of our past and, especially the painful parts. Um, that's something that we need to do to access that healing part of ourselves. And I think that ties in really beautifully when you think about relationships and how we need to heal in our relationships. It's very easy to cut people out of our lives and just say, nope, you're not respecting me, you're not respecting my boundaries, out with you. But then it becomes habitual, and we start doing that with everybody, out with you, out with you. And then we're alone. And we've alienated ourselves. And that's not to say that I condone anything negative or any kind of toxic behaviors, lateral violence, but to understand that, sometimes people can heal and sometimes relationships can get better. They can improve just as much as you were talking with that man and he's inebriated and, he had been, the perpetrator of domestic violence. But to understand that again, when we look at decolonizing, that's something that we have to unlearn, that that's not something that was natural to our indigenous people or our cultures, because that didn't exist. A long time ago. This is definitely a result of colonization. There were no women beaters on this land. There was no sexual violence. Again, people were very respectful. And so now, these are some of the things that we have learned, maybe as a result of colonization, maybe as a result of disconnection from ourselves, from our culture, and from Creator. And and when we're disconnected from Creator, now, and you introduce addictions even, now we're more likely to act out on a primal level, on a very animalistic level. And as not just Indigenous people, but people in the entire world, we have access to spirituality. We have access to intellect. We have a means to behave in a proper way. And so the more proper that we behave, and the more that we access that spiritual side of ourselves, the more connected we become to Creator. And we're the only, beings on this land that have that capability. You know, a lot of animals, of course, they have that tie to the natural world, but they don't have the intellect that we have. They don't have that ability to become spiritual. And so we're blessed in that sense. But we also have to understand as we're going on that journey, what that means for other people who aren't accessing their higher selves, who aren't accessing their spiritual side. And so in those instances, sometimes we do need to have things like difficult conversations. We have to be able to express boundaries. We have to be able to let people know when they've crossed a boundary and what that means to us, how that's created harm for us, and or the things that they could do to make it better. And of course, if you want more information on any of that, I talk about that ad nauseum on my podcast, Philanthropy, not philosophy, philanthropy. But I talk a lot about difficult conversations and I talk about conflict, because that's my life. That's what I talk about with my dissertation. It's all about conflict and spirituality. And so when we think about those relationships, we definitely need to be able to express those things because it is important. And to recognize that sometimes people, even if we express to them in the healthiest way possible, the things that they could do to improve this relationship or meet us halfway, they may never. And we have to understand that. And we have to understand that sometimes, you know what, we do let go of relationships, but that doesn't mean forever, right? We have to always acknowledge that at some point, and this is where prayer comes in and creator comes in, that we learn forgiveness and we learn to let go of the anger that holds us back from healing and understand that while we're on our own journey, people are on their own journeys too. And some of them maybe have barely begun, and maybe we will never see them begin in our lifetime. But that doesn't mean, we wish any bad will or harm upon them, that we pray for them and we say, you know what, I hope that, you learn, that you work on your healing and you understand. And so we don't look down on people, but we think, okay, you know what? I can only do what I can do. I can only take care of myself. And if you can meet me halfway, then maybe we can move forward and have a good relationship, together. And whether that be family, coworker, your community, or even, indigenous people and settler communities, it could, that's true for any level of relationship. I'm not sure where we are for time.
We've got like about a minute left. So yeah, I think that's probably a good place to leave it. I think unless you have any like closing thoughts, but I think that's an amazing kind of summary of kind of what you've been saying. So did you want any closing thoughts or
Hmm. Let me think. No, I think that covers a lot of what I really wanted to cover. I really want people to understand that relationships can be very tricky, but they can also be very rewarding, because unfortunately for us, we come in this solo individual package. And so we only know our own experience. And the more that we have relationships with others, the more we can see the world in different ways that we would never think of, that we would never see. And so that's the beautiful thing, not only in our own community to understand somebody else's experience, but also when we think of nation to nation, that somebody can experience a completely different culture and world. And, if we end up having good relations with them, we can learn amazing things that we would never have known. But if we, keep to ourselves all the time and we keep people away from us, then we're also inhibiting our own growth because again, I think of, you mentioned that I'm a yoga teacher and I am. And yoga itself means union with ourself, with creator, union with others, union with nature. And so, as spiritual beings on this earth, it's really important that we do try to have good relationships with others. Not only, just for peace and good harmony, but for our growth, for our spiritual growth. We will never grow spiritually if we are just by ourselves in nature, maybe tiny increments. We grow exponentially spiritually when we're around others and we work on having good relationships with them. So I think that's where I'll end.
that's a beautiful ending. Well, thank you. This has been Jess Iron talking on Homelands, Ekosi, Coapa Matina Waomina. That's all. We'll see you later.